The harsh winds of the Montana Territory carried no mercy as Katherine Hayes staggered along the dusty trail, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other desperately gripping a tattered shawl that did little to shield her from the biting autumn air of 1876. 6 months pregnant and utterly alone, she had been walking since dawn, her once fine boots now worn through at the soles, her feet bleeding and blistered. Katherine's thoughts drifted to Thomas, the silver-tongued businessman who had promised her the world, only to vanish when she'd told him about the child growing inside her. The memory of his final words still cut deeper than the cold. "I never claimed to be the marrying kind, Katie. This isn't my problem." He had left her with nothing but a hastily scribbled note, and the shame of being an unwed mother to be in a world that showed little compassion for such circumstances. She had been traveling westward for weeks now, chasing rumors of a new life in Eureka, Montana, a mining town where perhaps she might find work as a seamstress or cook. Her meager savings had run out 3 days prior, forcing her to sell her mother's silver locket, the last connection to her family back east, for a meal that had long since stopped sustaining her. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the mountains with golden light that might have seemed beautiful under different circumstances. Katherine's vision blurred, tiny black dots dancing before her eyes as her empty stomach clenched painfully. The dirt road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through the rugged landscape with no sign of civilization. "Just a little further," she whispered to her unborn child, though she had no idea how much farther she could go. Her lips were cracked, her throat parched from thirst. The canteen she carried had been empty since midday. The world tilted suddenly, the ground rushing up to meet her as her legs finally gave way. As consciousness slipped from her grasp, Katherine thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, but she couldn't be certain if it was real or merely the desperate hope of a dying woman. Xavier Stone had spent 12 years on his own since returning from the war between the states. At 34, he had built himself a life of quiet solitude on his ranch just outside of Eureka. The nightmares that had once plagued him nightly now only visited occasionally, allowing him some measure of peace as he tended his modest herd of cattle, and the 2-quarter horses he prized above all his possessions. He was returning from town, his saddlebags loaded with supplies, when he spotted what appeared to be a bundle of cloth on the trail ahead. It wasn't until he drew closer that he realized with a start that it was a woman, motionless in the dirt. "Whoa there, Brutus," he commanded his stallion, pulling back on the reins. Xavier dismounted quickly, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. Years of survival in the West had taught him to be wary of ambushes. But as he knelt beside the figure, he saw only a young woman, no more than 22 or 23, her face pale beneath a layer of dust, her honey-brown hair falling loose from what had once been a neat bun. His eyes widened as he noticed her rounded belly beneath the threadbare dress. "Madam," he called, gently turning her onto her back. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond, but he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Relief washed over him. She was alive, at least. Xavier quickly assessed her condition, noting the signs of exhaustion and dehydration. Her clothes, though dirty and worn, were of good quality, suggesting she hadn't always lived in such desperate circumstances. With careful movements, he retrieved his canteen and tipped a small amount of water between her parched lips. Some of it trickled down her chin, but she swallowed reflexively, a soft moan escaping her. "That's it," he encouraged, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just a little water for now." Xavier glanced up and down the trail, but they were alone for miles in either direction. Night would fall soon, bringing with it the dangerous cold of a Montana autumn. He couldn't leave her here, and the nearest town was too far for her condition. With a decision made, he gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her pregnancy. He whistled for Brutus, who obediently stepped forward. "Sorry, boy," Xavier muttered as he carefully maneuvered the woman onto his saddle, then mounted behind her, supporting her limp form against his chest. "We'll be moving slower than usual." As they set off toward his ranch, Xavier couldn't help but wonder what circumstances had led a pregnant woman to be wandering alone on this desolate trail. Whatever her story, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't in good conscience abandon her to her fate. The journey to his ranch took longer than usual with the extra burden, but Xavier maintained a steady pace, mindful of his unconscious passenger. The woman stirred occasionally, mumbling incoherent words but never fully awoke. By the time his modest cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees with smoke curling from the chimney, the last rays of sunlight had disappeared below the horizon. His ranch hand, an older man named Jasper who lived in a small cabin nearby, emerged at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "Mr. Stone, what in tarnation?" Jasper's words died on his lips as he caught sight of the woman cradled in Xavier's arms. "Found her collapsed on the trail," Xavier explained tersely as he dismounted, carefully holding the woman. "She's pregnant and in bad shape. Take care of Brutus, will you?" "Of course, sir," Jasper nodded, taking the reins. "Should I fetch the doctor from town?" Xavier considered this as he carried the woman toward his cabin. "Not yet. Let me see if she comes around first. If she doesn't improve by morning, we'll send for him." Inside the cabin, Xavier gently laid the unconscious woman on his bed, a sturdy oak frame with a straw-filled mattress covered in clean linens. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and he quickly added more logs, bringing warmth to the simple but well-kept interior. A wooden table with 4 chairs occupied one corner, while a rocking chair sat near the fireplace. Shelves lined with books, unusual for a frontier ranch, covered one wall, revealing a side of Xavier few in Eureka ever saw. He removed the woman's worn boots, wincing at the sight of her bloodied feet. With practiced efficiency from his war days, Xavier gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and what few medical supplies he kept on hand. He washed her feet gently, applied a salve made from herbs he'd learned about from a Crow medicine woman years ago, and wrapped them in clean bandages. Throughout his ministrations, the woman remained unconscious, though her breathing had become more regular. Her face, now cleaned of dirt, revealed delicate features and a natural beauty that surprised him. She was young, too young, he thought, to be in such a predicament. As he pulled a quilt over her, her eyelids fluttered briefly, and a soft moan escaped her lips. "Rest easy," Xavier said quietly. "You're safe now." He wasn't sure if she heard him, but her features seemed to relax slightly. Xavier pulled the rocking chair closer to the bed and settled in for what would likely be a long night of vigilance. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the cabin, but inside, the fire crackled reassuringly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Catherine's return to consciousness came slowly, like swimming up from the depths of a murky lake. First came sensations: warmth, softness beneath her, the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Then, awareness of her body, her throat parched, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but the sharp pain in her feet had dulled to a throbbing ache. When she finally opened her eyes, the unfamiliar ceiling above her brought a moment of panic. She tried to sit up, one hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Easy now," came a deep voice from nearby. "You're safe." Katherine turned her head to see a man rising from a rocking chair beside the bed. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and a neatly trimmed beard, he approached slowly, as if trying not to frighten her. His eyes, a striking shade of blue beneath heavy brows, watched her with concern. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. "My ranch about 5 miles outside of Eureka," he replied, pouring water from a pitcher into a cup. "I found you collapsed on the trail yesterday evening." He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her back with one strong arm while bringing the cup to her lips with his other hand. Katherine drank gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "Thank you," she whispered when she had finished. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "No need for thanks, madam. Anyone would have done the same." He set the cup aside. "I'm Xavier Stone. This is my ranch." "Katherine Hayes," she offered in return, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the fact that she was lying in this stranger's bed. Propriety demanded she feel scandalized, but she was too exhausted and grateful to summon the emotion. "How are you feeling, Miss Hayes? And the baby?" Katherine placed a protective hand over her belly, relieved to feel movement within. "Better, I think. The baby seems to be moving normally." She hesitated, then added, "I haven't eaten in. I'm not sure how long." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable. "I thought as much. I've got some broth warming on the stove. Do you think you could manage a little?" At her nod, he moved to a cast iron stove in the corner of the cabin, returning moments later with a steaming bowl and a spoon. He set them on a small table beside the bed. "Can you manage, or do you need help?" he asked, his tone matter-of-fact without a hint of judgment. Katherine's pride wanted to insist she could feed herself, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "I might need some assistance," she admitted reluctantly. Xavier sat on the edge of the bed and helped her with the first few spoonfuls until her hands steadied enough to continue on her own. The broth was simple but flavorful, with bits of vegetables and meat that tasted better than any fancy meal she'd ever had back east. As she ate, Katherine took in her surroundings. The cabin was modest but clean and well organized. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested their owner was more educated than the average rancher. The furnishings were simple but sturdy, and everything had a place. Through a window, she could see the first light of dawn breaking over distant mountains. "Mr. Stone," she began when the bowl was nearly empty, "I don't know how to thank you properly. You've shown me a kindness I can scarcely comprehend given my circumstances." She lowered her eyes, shame washing over her at the thought of her predicament. Xavier took the empty bowl from her hands. "Miss Hayes, I don't know your story and you don't owe me any explanations, but I want you to know something." He waited until she looked up at him before continuing, his gaze steady and sincere. "My home is yours now for as long as you need it." Katherine stared at him, speechless. In her experience, men didn't offer such generosity without expecting something in return. Yet there was no hint of impropriety in Xavier Stone's manner, only a straightforward compassion that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I couldn't impose," she stammered, though she had nowhere else to go. "It's not an imposition," he said firmly. "I've got plenty of space and it's no hardship having you here." A slight smile softened his weathered features. "Besides, my cooking could use some improvement. Once you're feeling better, perhaps you could teach me a thing or two." The gentle humor in his voice eased some of Katherine's tension. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook myself, Mr. Stone, but I can sew quite well, and I'm a decent hand with laundry and mending." "Then we'll manage just fine between us," he replied, standing. "Now you should rest more. I've sent my ranch hand Jasper to fetch Dr. Tillman from town to check on you and the baby, just to be safe." Panic flashed across Katherine's face. "A doctor? But I can't afford. Don't concern yourself with that, Xavier interrupted gently. Rest now. We can talk more later. As he moved to leave, Katherine called after him, Mr. Stone. When he turned back, she swallowed hard, fighting back tears. Thank you, truly. Xavier nodded once, his expression softening. You're welcome, Miss Hayes. After he left, closing the door behind him, Katherine sank back against the pillows, one hand resting protectively on her belly. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps here, in this unexpected place with this unexpected savior, she might find a way forward for herself and her child. Dr. Tillman arrived mid-morning, a portly man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately set Katherine at ease. He examined her thoroughly, paying special attention to her swollen ankles and listening intently to the baby's heartbeat through an odd-looking trumpet-shaped device he called a stethoscope. The little one seems healthy enough, he pronounced finally, packing his instruments back into his black bag. Strong heartbeat, good position. I'd say you're about 6 months along, give or take a week, Katherine nodded. That sounds right. As for you, young lady, the doctor continued, his tone becoming stern, you've pushed yourself to the brink of collapse. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, exhaustion, any one of these could have caused you to lose the baby, not to mention your own life. She lowered her eyes, chastened. I didn't have much choice, Dr. Tillman. The doctor's expression softened. Well, you're in good hands now. Xavier Stone might keep to himself, but he's a decent man. Known him since he came back from the war all those years ago. He turned to Xavier, who stood leaning against the doorframe. She needs rest, proper food, and no exertion for at least a week. After that, light activity only. I'll come back in a few days to check on her progress. Understood, Xavier replied. Thank you for coming out, Doc. After the doctor left, Katherine found herself alone with Xavier once more. An awkward silence settled between them until she finally spoke. Mr. Stone, I feel I should explain my situation. He raised a hand. As I said before, you don't owe me any explanations. Perhaps not, she conceded, but I'd like to give one all the same. You've taken me into your home, you deserve to know who you're sheltering. Xavier considered this, then nodded, taking a seat in the rocking chair beside the bed. Very well, Miss Hayes, I'm listening. Katherine took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I come from Boston. My father was a professor at the university there, and we lived comfortably enough until he passed away 3 years ago. My mother had died when I was a child, so I was left alone. I worked as a seamstress and managed to support myself adequately. She paused, her hands twisting nervously in the quilt covering her lap. Last winter, I met a man named Thomas Whitfield. He was charming, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in me. He claimed to be a businessman with interests out west. A bitter smile crossed her face. I was naive enough to believe him when he spoke of marriage, of a future together. Xavier's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had hardened slightly at the predictable turn in her story. When I discovered I was with child, I went to him immediately, certain he would make good on his promises. Katherine's voice faltered. Instead, he told me he was already married with children back in New York. He gave me $50 and suggested I take care of the problem before disappearing from Boston entirely. She looked up, meeting Xavier's gaze directly, determined not to show shame for what wasn't her fault. I couldn't do what he suggested, it went against everything I believe. But I also couldn't stay in Boston, where the scandal would have ruined what little reputation I had left. So I decided to head west, where no one would know me. I'd heard there were opportunities for women in frontier towns, even those in my condition. Xavier nodded slowly. And you chose Eureka. I met a woman on the stagecoach who mentioned it, was a growing town with a need for seamstresses and teachers. She said people there didn't ask too many questions about one's past. Katherine sighed. My money ran out faster than I anticipated. By the time you found me, I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and I'd been walking since the previous morning after the last wagon driver who offered me a ride wanted. Payment I wasn't willing to provide. A muscle tightened in Xavier's jaw at this last revelation, but he kept his voice even. You've shown remarkable courage, Miss Hayes. Or remarkable foolishness, she countered with a self-deprecating smile. Either way, I want you to know that I don't expect charity. Once I'm well enough, I intend to find work and make my own way. Xavier leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Miss Hayes, Eureka isn't Boston. It's a rough mining town with few amenities and fewer opportunities for a woman alone, especially one expecting a child. The men outnumber women 10-1, and not all of them are gentlemen. His blue eyes held her steadily. My offer stands. Stay here until the baby comes, at least. You'll be safe and you can help around the ranch as you're able. Katherine hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. People will talk, Mr. Stone. A single woman living in a bachelor's home, it could damage your reputation. A brief smile crossed Xavier's face. I don't have much of a reputation to damage, Miss Hayes. Most folks in town already think I'm a peculiar recluse. He stood up, his tall frame imposing yet somehow reassuring. Besides, Jasper's wife, Martha, lives in the smaller cabin on the property. She can act as chaperone to satisfy propriety, and she'll be glad of another woman's company. Put that way, his offer seemed not only generous but sensible. Katherine found herself nodding slowly. Very well, Mr. Stone. I accept your kindness temporarily, but I insist on earning my keep as soon as Dr. Tillman allows. Fair enough. Xavier moved toward the door. Rest now. I'll bring you some more substantial food in a while. After he left, Katherine sank back against the pillows, exhaustion overtaking her once more. As sleep claimed her, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt truly safe. The next week passed in a blur of rest and recovery for Katherine. True to Xavier's word, Martha, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s, became a regular visitor, bringing homemade remedies and endless chatter that brightened the cabin. Under their combined care, Katherine's strength returned gradually, and by the end of the week, Dr. Tillman pronounced her well enough for light activity. Just don't overdo it, he cautioned before leaving. That baby needs you strong and healthy. As soon as she was able, Katherine insisted on helping with household tasks. Xavier had initially protested, but she had been firm. Mr. Stone, if I spend another day doing nothing but resting, I shall go mad, she declared one morning over breakfast. Please, allow me to be useful. Xavier had studied her determined expression and finally relented with a nod. As you wish, Miss Hayes, but nothing strenuous. That day marked the beginning of a new routine. Katherine took over much of the cooking, discovering to her surprise that she enjoyed the task when not constrained by hunger and desperation. She also began mending Xavier's clothes, which showed signs of hasty, utilitarian repairs by a hand more accustomed to roping cattle than threading needles. One evening, as Xavier returned from working with the herd, he found Katherine sitting by the fire, one of his shirts in her lap, her needle flashing in the firelight as she repaired a torn seam with tiny, precise stitches. You don't need to do that, he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Katherine looked up with a smile that transformed her face, lighting her eyes in a way that caught Xavier off guard. I don't mind. It's satisfying to fix things. He watched her for a moment, struck by how quickly she had become a part of his home, filling it with small touches that made the cabin feel different, warmer somehow. Fresh wildflowers now stood in a jar on the table, and she had rearranged his books into a more sensible order. The scent of freshly baked bread often greeted him when he returned from working the ranch. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. "Better. The baby has been quite active." She set aside her sewing and placed a hand on her growing belly. "Would you like to feel?" "It's quite remarkable." Xavier hesitated, unaccustomed to such intimacy, but Catherine's open expression contained no guile or hidden meaning. Slowly, he moved to kneel beside her chair, and she took his calloused hand, placing it gently against the side of her abdomen. For a moment, nothing happened, and Xavier was about to withdraw his hand when he felt a distinct nudge against his palm. His eyes widened in surprise. That's the baby?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Katherine nodded, her expression tender. "Yes, strong, isn't it?" Another kick, stronger this time, and Xavier couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "Seems like a determined little one." "Just like its mother," Katherine replied with a small laugh. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection neither had anticipated. Xavier withdrew his hand slowly, clearing his throat. "I should wash up before supper," he said, standing. Katherine watched him go, a curious warmth spreading through her chest. Xavier Stone remained something of a mystery to her, a man of few words who nevertheless showed his character through actions rather than speech. Over the past week, she had learned little of his past beyond the fact that he had fought in the war and had established his ranch 10 years ago. What she did know was that he worked from dawn until dusk, read voraciously by lamplight in the evenings, and treated her with unfailing respect and consideration. Not once had he made her feel like a burden or suggested that her situation was of her own making. As the days turned into weeks, Katherine found herself settling into life at the Stone Ranch with surprising ease. October gave way to November, bringing colder temperatures and occasional snow flurries that blanketed the Montana landscape in white. Xavier insisted that Katherine take his bed while he slept on a pallet near the fire, an arrangement she had initially protested, but eventually accepted with gratitude as her pregnancy advanced and made sleep increasingly difficult. One evening in mid-November, as a snowstorm howled outside, Katherine sat at the table helping Xavier go through his ledgers. She had discovered a talent for numbers and organization that complemented his practical knowledge of ranching. "If these calculations are correct," she said, frowning at the columns of figures, "the profit from your last cattle sale should have been higher." Xavier leaned over her shoulder to examine the numbers, his presence warm and solid behind her. "You're right. Henderson must have shorted me again." "This isn't the first time," he shrugged, straightening. "Henderson owns the largest cattle operation in the territory. He also owns the railway spur that gets our beef to market. We smaller ranchers don't have much choice but to accept his terms." Katherine tapped her pencil against the ledger thoughtfully. "What if you combined your shipments with other small ranchers? Together, you might have enough leverage to negotiate better rates." Xavier looked at her with new respect. "That's not a bad idea, actually. Johnson and Wilkins have both complained about Henderson's tactics. We might be able to work something out." "It's worth considering," Katherine said, pleased that he took her suggestion seriously. "After all, united you stand, divided you fall, isn't that what they say?" A ghost of a smile crossed Xavier's face. "Indeed they do, Miss Hayes." Later that night, as Katherine lay in bed listening to the wind rattling the windows, she reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. 3 weeks ago, she had been on the verge of death, abandoned and desperate. Now, against all odds, she had found not just shelter but a place where she felt valued and respected. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, a promise to her unborn child and to herself. Across the room, Xavier lay awake as well, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Having Katherine in his home had disrupted the solitary routine he had maintained for years, and yet he found he didn't mind. Her presence brought a lightness to his days that had been absent for longer than he cared to remember. It troubled him how quickly he had grown accustomed to her company, to their conversations over meals, to the sight of her sewing by the fire in the evenings. She would leave eventually, he knew that. Once her baby was born and she had regained her strength, she would want to make her own way, as she had made abundantly clear. It was the right thing, the proper thing, and yet the thought left him with an unexpected hollowness. Xavier turned onto his side, willing himself to sleep. He would not allow himself to become attached. Katherine Hayes needed his help, not his complicated feelings. He would continue to provide her with shelter and support, and when the time came for her to leave, he would wish her well and return to his solitary existence. It was the only sensible path forward. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with honey-brown hair and a smile that could light up the darkest corners of a man's soul. As November progressed, the routine at the Stone Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Katherine's pregnancy advanced without complications, though her increased size made movement more cumbersome. Xavier found himself watching her carefully, ready to assist whenever she needed help, though she rarely asked for it directly. One morning, Xavier returned from the barn to find Katherine struggling to reach a jar on a high shelf in the kitchen. Without a word, he stepped behind her and easily retrieved it, setting it on the counter. "Thank you," she said, slightly breathless. "I'm afraid I'm becoming rather useless as this child grows." "Nonsense," Xavier replied firmly. "You're doing the most important work there is, bringing a new life into the world." Katherine looked up at him, surprised by the vehemence in his tone. "That's a generous way of looking at it." Xavier's expression softened. "It's the truth. My mother had 5 children, and she always said that growing a baby was harder work than plowing a field." It was the first time he had mentioned his family, and Katherine seized the opportunity to learn more about the reticent man who had become her protector. "You have siblings, then?" she asked casually, measuring flour into a bowl for bread. Xavier leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "Had 2 brothers died in the war. One sister died of influenza as a child. The youngest, my sister Anne, lives in Denver with her husband." "I'm sorry about your brothers," Katherine said softly. "Were you close?" A shadow crossed his face. "Yes. Matthew was 2 years older, James 2 years younger. We enlisted together when the war broke out." "You fought for the Union," Xavier nodded. "Our father was a staunch abolitionist. He'd have disowned us if we'd gone Confederate, though being from Pennsylvania, it wasn't much of a question." "And your parents? Both gone now. Father's heart gave out in '68. Mother followed him a year later." He straightened, as if realizing he had shared more than he intended. "What about your family?" Katherine kneaded the bread dough with practiced movements. "As I mentioned, my mother died when I was young, consumption. My father raised me alone. He was a professor of literature, more comfortable with books than people, but he was kind and did his best." She smiled at the memory. "He read to me every night, everything from Shakespeare to Dickens. He believed education was important for girls as well as boys." "A progressive man," Xavier commented. "Yes, though it didn't make him popular with some of his colleagues." She shaped the dough into a loaf and placed it in a pan to rise. "He would have been disappointed in me, I think, for my situation." Xavier studied her for a moment. "I'm not so sure." A man who valued education and independent thinking might have understood that people can make mistakes and that the measure of a person is not in never falling, but in how they rise afterward. Katherine looked up, touched by his words. "That's a kind interpretation, Mr. Stone." "Xavier," he said suddenly. "I beg your pardon, my name is Xavier. We've been sharing a home for nearly a month now. I think you can call me by my given name." Katherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Very well, Xavier, and you must call me Katherine." "Katherine," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. It sounded different when he said it, warmer somehow, more intimate. An awkward silence fell between them, charged with something neither was prepared to acknowledge. Finally, Xavier cleared his throat. "I need to ride into town for supplies. Is there anything you need?" Katherine considered. "Some more yarn if possible. I'd like to knit some things for the baby." He nodded. "I'll see what Mrs. Hollister has at the general store." After Xavier had departed, Katherine found herself humming softly as she finished her kitchen tasks. She caught herself in the act and paused, surprised by her own contentment. For all the uncertainty of her situation, she had found an unexpected peace here in this rustic cabin with a man who asked nothing of her, but allowed her to maintain her dignity through contribution rather than charity. It was dangerous, she knew, this growing attachment she felt toward Xavier Stone. Come spring, after the baby was born, she would need to move on, to establish her independence and build a life for herself and her child. Allowing herself to become too comfortable here, too dependent on Xavier's kindness, would only make that inevitable separation more difficult. And yet, in moments of quiet honesty with herself, Katherine admitted that her feelings for her rescuer had evolved beyond mere gratitude. She admired his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and the gentle consideration he showed her despite his outward reserve. More than once, she had caught herself watching him as he read by the fire in the evenings, his strong profile illuminated by the dancing flames, and wondering what it might be like to belong here permanently, to create a family with him. Such thoughts were foolish fantasies, she chided herself. Xavier had never given any indication that he saw her as anything more than a woman in need of assistance. His kindness stemmed from decency, not romantic interest. And even if he did harbor such feelings, what man would want to take on another man's child, and a woman whose reputation was already compromised? No, Katherine resolved as she wiped flour from her hands. She would accept his generosity with gratitude for as long as it was offered, but she would guard her heart carefully against hopes that could only lead to disappointment. Xavier returned from town later than expected, his expression tight with suppressed anger as he stomped snow from his boots at the door. "Is everything all right?" Katherine asked, alarmed by his unusual demeanor. He removed his coat and hat before answering. "Just some unpleasantness in town." "Nothing for you to worry about." But Katherine wasn't so easily dissuaded. "Xavier, what happened?" he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I overheard some talk at the general store. Apparently, news of your presence here has sparked gossip." Katherine's heart sank. "I feared as much." "What are they saying?" Xavier's jaw tightened. "Nothing worth repeating, please," she insisted. "I need to know." He met her gaze reluctantly. "Some are suggesting that I've taken advantage of your situation. Others imply that you're not as respectable as you claim to be." His voice hardened. "I set them straight." "How?" Katherine asked, dreading the answer. "I simply told them the truth, that you're a lady of good character who fell on hard times, and that anyone suggesting otherwise would answer to me." A muscle twitched in his cheek. Henderson's son made a particularly crude remark. "He'll be sporting a black eye for the next week or so." "Oh, Xavier," Katherine sighed, dismayed. "You shouldn't have to defend your reputation because of me." "I wasn't defending my reputation," he replied firmly. "I was defending yours." Their eyes met, and Katherine felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection that had been growing steadily since her arrival. "Thank you," she said softly, "but perhaps we should reconsider our arrangement. I wouldn't want to cause you trouble in town." Xavier shook his head decisively. "The only trouble would be if I allowed small-minded gossip to dictate my actions. You're staying, Katherine, unless—" He hesitated. "Unless you wish to leave." "No," she admitted, the word barely audible. "I don't wish to leave." Relief flickered across his features. "Good. That's settled then." He reached into his saddlebag and produced several skeins of yarn in soft colors: pale blue, cream, and a delicate green. Mrs. Hollister said these would be suitable for baby things. Katherine accepted the yarn with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, troubled by the knowledge that her presence was causing difficulties for the man who had shown her nothing but kindness. That night, long after Xavier had fallen asleep on his pallet by the fire, Katherine lay awake, her thoughts in turmoil. The growing awareness of her feelings for him, combined with the complications her presence was causing in his life, left her uncertain of the right path forward. She had never intended to bring scandal to Xavier's door, or to put him in a position where he felt obligated to defend her honor with his fists. Perhaps, she thought, as she finally drifted toward sleep, the solution would become clearer in the light of day. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought heavy snowfall that blanketed the ranch in white, effectively isolating Xavier and Katherine from town. While the weather made ranch work more challenging, Xavier found himself grateful for the enforced seclusion. It gave Katherine a respite from town gossip and allowed them to settle more deeply into their shared routine. The approaching holiday also brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Katherine, determined to make Christmas special despite their circumstances, set about creating small decorations for the cabin: paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling beams, pine boughs arranged on the mantel, and red berries gathered from hardy shrubs that peeked through the snow. Xavier watched her preparations with bemused tolerance that gradually transformed into genuine appreciation. He couldn't remember the last time he had celebrated Christmas properly. The war had stolen his taste for festivities, and the subsequent years of solitude had made such efforts seem pointless. But Katherine's simple joy in the season awakened long-dormant memories of family gatherings and childhood excitement. One evening, a week before Christmas, Xavier returned from checking the cattle to find Katherine struggling to hang a small garland above the doorway, balanced precariously on a chair despite her advanced pregnancy. "Katherine," he exclaimed, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "What are you doing?" She turned at the sound of his voice, losing her balance slightly. Xavier moved swiftly, his hands going to her waist to steady her. The warmth of his touch, even through the fabric of her dress, sent an unexpected thrill through Katherine's body. "I was just—" she began, but Xavier interrupted, his voice stern with concern. "You could have fallen." "The baby is fine," she assured him, placing her hand over his where it rested on her waist. "I was being careful." Their eyes met, and suddenly Katherine was acutely aware of their proximity, of Xavier's strong hands supporting her, of the way his eyes had darkened to the color of a stormy sea. "Let me help you down," he said, his voice rough. With careful movements, Xavier lifted her from the chair as if she weighed nothing at all, setting her gently on her feet but not immediately removing his hands from her waist. For a heartbeat, they stood there, closer than propriety allowed, neither willing to be the first to step away. It was Katherine who finally broke the spell, lowering her eyes and taking a small step backward. "Thank you," she murmured. "I shouldn't have been so foolish." Xavier dropped his hands to his sides, his expression unreadable. "What were you trying to do?" She gestured to the small bundle of greenery tied with a red ribbon. "It's mistletoe, a Christmas tradition from back east." Understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes, followed by something that might have been regret as he stepped back further. "I know the tradition," he said quietly. "Next time, ask for my help with such things, please." "I will," Katherine promised, her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry for worrying you." Xavier nodded once before turning to hang up his coat. "No harm done, but Dr. Tillman would have my hide if anything happened to you or the baby." That night, as they sat by the fire, Katherine knitting a small blanket for her baby, Xavier reading from one of his books, a comfortable silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the soft click of knitting needles. Yet beneath the outward calm, both were acutely aware of the moment they had shared, of boundaries almost crossed and words left unspoken. Katherine stole glances at Xavier when she thought he wouldn't notice, studying the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful concentration in his eyes as he read. What would it be like, she wondered, to be truly his, not just a woman he had rescued, but a woman he had chosen across the room? Xavier found himself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word, his mind replaying the feel of Katherine's soft curves beneath his hands. He had never intended this, had never expected to develop feelings for the pregnant woman he had found on the trail. Yet here he was, fighting a growing desire to cross the room, take the knitting from her hands, and confess the emotions that had been building within him for weeks. But he remained in his chair, bound by honor, and the knowledge that Katherine's vulnerable position made any declaration from him potentially coercive. She depended on him for shelter and protection. How could she freely reject any advances when doing so might jeopardize her security? No, Xavier decided as he forced his attention back to his book. He would continue as before, offering support without expectation, friendship without demands. If there was to be anything more between them, it would have to wait until Katherine was safely delivered of her child and able to make truly independent choices about her future. Christmas Eve arrived with a break in the weather, the sky clearing to reveal a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Xavier had been mysteriously absent for much of the afternoon, telling Katherine only that he had errands to attend to, despite the fact that the snow made travel to town impossible. He returned as dusk fell, his cheeks ruddy from cold but his eyes bright with anticipation. "Close your eyes," he instructed as he removed his coat. "Why?" Katherine asked, puzzled. "It's a surprise. Please." Intrigued, Katherine complied, hearing Xavier move around the cabin, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. "Can I look now?" "Just a moment," he replied, and she heard more movement, then a strange rustling. "All right, open your eyes." Katherine did and gasped in delight. In the corner of the cabin stood a small pine tree, its branches adorned with strings of dried berries, pine cones dusted with flour to resemble snow, and a few precious glass ornaments that must have been carefully preserved for many years. "A Christmas tree," she breathed, moving closer to admire it. "Oh, Xavier, it's beautiful." "It's not much compared to what you probably had in Boston," he said, watching her reaction carefully. Katherine shook her head, touching one of the glass ornaments gently. "No, it's perfect." "But these ornaments, they must be precious to you." "They were my mother's," Xavier admitted. "I haven't displayed them since she died. They've been packed away in a trunk in the barn." The significance of the gesture brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "Thank you for sharing them with me." "It means more than I can say." Xavier smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his serious face and made him look years younger. "There's more," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I know it's customary to wait until Christmas morning, but I thought perhaps we could exchange gifts now," Katherine finished for him, moving to retrieve a package of her own from beneath her pillow. "I had the same thought." They sat before the fire, and Katherine opened her gift first, carefully untying the string. Inside the paper was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. When she opened it, a gentle melody began to play. "A music box," she whispered, enchanted by the simple tune. "I thought the baby might like the music," Xavier explained, seeming almost shy. "And later, when the child is older, it can hold small treasures." Katherine's throat tightened with emotion. "It's wonderful, thank you." She handed him her own package. "Now yours. It's not much, I'm afraid." Xavier unwrapped the gift to find a knitted scarf in deep blue wool, along with a matching pair of gloves. The stitches were neat and even, the wool soft but sturdy. "I noticed your old scarf was rather worn," Katherine explained, watching anxiously for his reaction. "The wool came from that skein Martha brought over. I worked on it while you were out with the cattle." Xavier ran his fingers over the careful stitches, deeply moved by the thought of Katherine spending hours creating something just for him. "No one has made me anything by hand since my mother died," he said quietly. "Thank you, Katherine. I'll treasure these." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and in that moment, all the unspoken feelings that had been building for weeks seemed to hover in the air, too powerful to be contained any longer. "Katherine," Xavier began, his voice low and uncertain. "I need to tell you," but whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by Katherine's sudden gasp, her hands flying to her belly. "What is it?" Xavier asked, instantly alert. "Is it the baby? Should I fetch the doctor?" Katherine took a deep breath, her expression a mixture of surprise and discomfort. "No, I don't think so. It was just a very strong kick." She placed her hand on a particular spot. "Here, feel." Xavier hesitated only briefly before placing his hand where she indicated. The baby kicked again, hard enough that he could feel the distinct shape of what might have been a tiny foot or elbow. "That's quite a fighter you've got there," he said with a small smile. "Indeed." Katherine covered his hand with her own, keeping it pressed against her belly. "Xavier, what were you going to say?" He looked into her eyes, so trusting and open, and found he couldn't bring himself to burden her with his feelings, not yet, not while she was still dependent on him and preparing to bring a new life into the world. "Just that I'm glad you're here," he said instead, the words true even if they weren't all he wanted to express. "This is the first Christmas in many years that has felt meaningful." Katherine smiled, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her features so quickly he might have imagined it. "For me as well," she replied softly. They remained like that for a moment longer, connected by the movement of the child beneath their hands, before Xavier reluctantly withdrew his touch and stood. "It's getting late," he said. "You should rest. Tomorrow is Christmas, after all." Katherine nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. As she moved toward the bed, she paused beside the mistletoe hanging in the doorway. For a heartbeat, she seemed to consider something, glancing back at Xavier with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "Merry Christmas, Xavier," she said finally. "Merry Christmas, Katherine," he replied, watching as she disappeared into the bedroom, taking a piece of his heart with her. January brought bitterly cold weather and increasing discomfort for Katherine as her pregnancy entered its final stages. Her back ached constantly, her ankles swelled despite frequent rest, and sleep became elusive as the baby grew more active. Through it all, Xavier remained attentive and considerate, taking on more household tasks despite Catherine's protests that she wasn't an invalid. "You need to conserve your strength," he insisted one morning after finding her attempting to sweep the floor. "The baby will be here soon enough, and then you'll need all your energy." The imminent arrival of the child had become a frequent topic of discussion, though both carefully avoided the question of what would happen afterward. Katherine had initially spoken of moving to town once she had recovered from the birth, but as her due date approached, such plans seemed increasingly nebulous. For his part, Xavier found himself dreading the day when Katherine and her child would leave his home. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the soft sound of her humming as she worked, to their conversations over meals and quiet evenings by the fire. The thought of returning to his solitary existence left him with an emptiness he could scarcely bear to contemplate. One particularly cold night in late January, Katherine awoke to find Xavier stoking the fire, his expression troubled in the flickering light. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, pushing herself to a sitting position. He turned, surprised to find her awake. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," she assured him. "The baby is restless tonight." Xavier nodded, returning to his seat by the fire. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the flames and the occasional howl of the wind outside. "What will you name the child?" Xavier asked eventually, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Katherine considered the question. "If it's a boy, I thought perhaps William, after my father. For a girl, maybe Elizabeth or Mary." "Good, strong names," Xavier approved. Another silence fell between them, heavier this time, laden with unasked questions and unspoken fears. "Xavier," Katherine began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happens after the baby comes." He tensed visibly but kept his voice even. "Oh, yes." She twisted her hands in her lap, gathering her courage. "I know we've spoken of me finding work in town, perhaps as a seamstress or teacher, but I'm not certain that's the right path anymore." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "What are you considering instead?" Katherine took a deep breath. "I've grown to care for this place for your ranch. I'm good with the accounts and I could learn more about the operations. Martha has mentioned that she and Jasper are thinking of moving to Denver to be near their daughter when she has her baby." "They have mentioned that to me as well," Xavier acknowledged. "So you'll need help," Katherine continued, her words coming faster now. "And I need a home for my child, a safe place with clean air and space to grow." She met his gaze directly. "I'm proposing a practical arrangement. I could stay on as your housekeeper and bookkeeper. You would provide shelter for me and my child, and in return, I would manage your household and assist with the business aspects of the ranch." Xavier studied her face in the firelight, his own expression unreadable. "A practical arrangement," he repeated slowly. "Yes," Katherine affirmed, though something flickered in her eyes that suggested she might be hoping for more. "It would benefit us both, I think." Xavier stood suddenly, pacing to the window where frost patterns decorated the glass. His back to her, he asked quietly, "Is that what you truly want, Katherine? A position as my employee?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with months of shared glances, careful touches, and growing feelings neither had fully acknowledged. "I want to stay," Katherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "However that might be possible." Xavier turned back to face her, his eyes intense in the firelight. "And if I said I wanted more than a practical arrangement? If I told you that the thought of you leaving has become unbearable to me, that I've grown to care for you in a way I never expected or thought possible again?" Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "I would say that I've felt the same," she admitted, her heart pounding. "But I feared you saw me only as a burden, a responsibility you had taken on out of kindness." Xavier crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "Never a burden," he said fervently. "A gift. An unexpected blessing that I've been afraid to acknowledge for fear of taking advantage of your situation." "My situation," Katherine repeated, confused. "Your dependence on me," Xavier explained, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "How could I speak of my feelings when you might feel obligated to reciprocate simply to maintain your security?" Understanding dawned in Katherine's eyes. "Oh, Xavier," she sighed, bringing one hand to his cheek. "I may have needed your help, but I've never felt obligated to you in that way. My feelings are genuine and entirely my own." Xavier turned his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm, sending a shiver of delight up Katherine's arm. "Then perhaps we should consider a different arrangement," he suggested, his voice deepening. "Not employer and employee, but husband and wife." Katherine's eyes widened. "Are you asking—" "I'm asking you to marry me," Xavier confirmed, his gaze steady and sure. "Not out of practicality or convenience, but because I've fallen in love with you, Katherine Hayes. Because I want to be a father to your child and perhaps, God willing, more children of our own one day." Tears filled Katherine's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Stone." His face transformed with happiness, years of solitude and reserve melting away as he leaned forward to place a gentle, reverent kiss on her lips. It was a brief touch, sweet and tender, a promise of the life they would build together. When they parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find love again, especially not with a woman I found unconscious on a trail," he said with a soft laugh. Katherine smiled through her tears. "And I never imagined that being abandoned and left destitute would lead me to the happiness I've found with you." Xavier placed his hand on her belly, where the baby had begun to kick, as if sensing the momentous change in its mother's life. "Your child will never know what it means to be unwanted," he promised solemnly. "I will love him or her as my own always." "I know you will," Katherine replied, covering his hand with hers. "You've shown me what kind of man you are through your actions these past months. Our child, for that, is how I already think of this baby will be blessed to have you as a father." They remained together by the fire until dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains, making plans for their future and savoring the newfound acknowledgement of their love. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the frost-covered window, Xavier sealed their engagement with another kiss, this one deeper and more passionate than the first, a promise of all that was to come. 4 days later, Katherine awoke in the pre-dawn darkness to a sharp pain that radiated across her abdomen. She lay still, waiting to see if it would return, and when it did several minutes later, she knew that her time had come. "Xavier," she called softly, not wanting to alarm him unnecessarily. He was at her side in an instant, immediately alert despite the early hour. "What is it?" "I think the baby is coming," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "The pains have begun." Xavier's eyes widened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I'll send Jasper for the doctor. How far apart are the pains?" "Several minutes, I think. It's just beginning." He nodded, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Then we have time. Try to rest while you can. I'll make sure everything is ready." The next hours passed in a blur of increasing discomfort for Katherine. Xavier sent Jasper to town for Dr. Tillman and enlisted Martha's help, the older woman arriving with a basket of clean linens and herbs for tea. "This isn't my first birthing," Martha assured Katherine as she helped her walk slowly around the cabin, a proven method for easing labor pains and encouraging the baby's progress. "Everything is proceeding normally," dear. By midday, the pains had intensified and come closer together. Dr. Tillman arrived, his usually jovial face serious as he examined Katherine. "The baby is positioned correctly," he announced, "but we still have some time to go. First babies often take their time making an entrance." Xavier, banished to the main room of the cabin while the doctor performed his examination, paced restlessly, pausing only when Katherine's cries of pain penetrated the closed door. Each sound tore at his heart, and more than once he moved toward the bedroom, only to be intercepted by Jasper. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time," the older man reminded him, pressing a cup of coffee into his hands. "The doc and Martha know what they're doing." As the afternoon wore on and Katherine's labor intensified, Xavier found himself praying fervently for her safety and that of the child, prayers he hadn't uttered since his brothers had fallen in the war. The thought of losing Katherine now, when they had just found each other, was unbearable. The winter sun was setting when a new sound finally pierced the cabin, the thin, indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Xavier froze mid-stride, his heart seeming to stop as he waited for further news. Martha emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, her face wreathed in smiles despite her obvious exhaustion. "Congratulations, Mr. Stone," she said warmly. "You have a son, a fine, healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Relief washed over Xavier in a dizzying wave. "And Katherine?" "Tired but well," Martha assured him. "Dr. Tillman is just finishing up, and then you can see them both." The wait for the doctor's permission to enter seemed interminable, but finally Dr. Tillman emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Mother and child are doing remarkably well," he confirmed, clapping Xavier on the shoulder. "She's asking for you." Xavier entered the bedroom with uncharacteristic hesitation, unprepared for the sight that greeted him. Katherine, propped up against pillows, her face pale but radiant with joy, held a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he approached, a smile spreading across her tired features. "Xavier," she said softly, "come meet your son." He moved to the bedside, overwhelmed by emotion as he gazed down at the tiny face nestled against Katherine's breast. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a small, perfectly formed face currently scrunched in sleep. "He's beautiful," Xavier whispered, reaching out to touch the infant's cheek with a gentle finger. "Just like his mother." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "Would you like to hold him?" With reverent care, Xavier took the swaddled infant into his arms, marveling at how such a tiny being could fill his heart with so much love. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a deep blue gaze that seemed to look directly into Xavier's soul. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm going to be your pa." The simple statement, spoken with such certainty and love, brought fresh tears to Katherine's eyes. This was what she had feared. She would never have a loving family for her child, a man who would accept them both without reservation. "What shall we name him?" Xavier asked, carefully returning the baby to Katherine's arms. "William Xavier Stone," she replied without hesitation, "after my father and the man who saved us both." Xavier's throat tightened with emotion. "It's a fine name," he managed to say, "a name for a boy who will grow into a good man." He perched carefully on the edge of the bed, mindful of Katherine's exhausted state, and placed his arm around her shoulders, drawing her and the baby close. In that moment, holding his new family, Xavier felt a sense of completion he had never known before, as if a missing piece of himself had finally been found. "I love you," he said simply, pressing a kiss to Katherine's temple. "Both of you." "And we love you," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "We're home at last." 2 weeks after William's birth, On a clear February morning with the sun glinting off the snow-covered landscape, Xavier and Katherine were married in the small church in Eureka. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Martha and Jasper serving as witnesses and baby William sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. Katherine wore a modest blue dress that Martha had helped her alter to fit her post-pregnancy figure. With a small bouquet of dried flowers Xavier had preserved from the previous summer. As they exchanged vows, her eyes never left Xavier's face, her heart full to bursting with the joy of their unexpected love story. The town gossips had plenty to say about the hasty wedding and the baby who had arrived conveniently beforehand, but Xavier and Katherine paid them no mind. They knew the truth of their relationship, that it had been built on respect, kindness, and a growing love that had nothing to do with scandal or impropriety. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the mountains and valleys around the Stone Ranch, Katherine found herself settling into motherhood with a contentment she had never thought possible during those desperate days on the trail. William grew quickly, a happy, healthy baby with Xavier's serious blue eyes and Katherine's sweet temperament. Xavier proved to be a natural father, handling the infant with a gentleness that belied his strong, weathered hands. In the evenings, he would often sit in the rocking chair by the fire, William cradled against his chest, telling the baby stories of the ranch and the animals, of the mountains and the changing seasons. "He can't understand a word you're saying," Katherine would sometimes tease as she mended by the fire. "Maybe not the words," Xavier would reply with a smile, "but he understands the love behind them." True to her word, Katherine took over the ranch accounts, discovering a talent for business that complemented Xavier's practical knowledge of cattle and land management. Together, they implemented her idea of joining forces with other small ranchers to negotiate better shipping rates, forming a cooperative that soon became a formidable counterbalance to Henderson's monopoly. As William's first birthday approached, Katherine found herself feeling unwell in the mornings, a familiar symptom that she recognized with a mixture of surprise and joy. When Dr. Tillman confirmed her suspicions, she waited until evening after William had been put to bed to share the news with Xavier. "Another baby," he repeated, his expression transforming from shock to delight. "Are you certain?" Katherine nodded, her hands clasped in his. "Dr. Tillman says the baby should arrive in the fall-October, most likely." Xavier gathered her into his arms, his embrace careful but exuberant. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "When I found you on that trail last year, I was just trying to do the right thing. I never imagined you would become my entire world." Katherine reached up to touch his face, tracing the features that had become so dear to her. "When Thomas abandoned me, I thought my life was over," she said softly. "I never dreamed that what seemed like the worst moment of my life would lead me to the best." Their lips met in a tender kiss, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown between them, a love born of compassion, nurtured by respect and strengthened by shared hardship and joy. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched in all directions, beautiful and harsh, unforgiving and bountiful. But within the walls of their cabin, Xavier and Katherine had created a haven of love and security, a home where once there had been only solitude and despair. As they prepared for bed that night, Xavier paused at the bedroom window, looking out at the star-filled sky above their ranch. "I used to think I was meant to be alone," he said quietly. "That after the war, after losing my brothers, I didn't deserve happiness." Katherine came to stand beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. And now he turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Now I understand that happiness isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's something you choose every day in how you live and who you love. A wise philosophy, Mr. Stone, Katherine smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. I have a wise wife, Mrs. Stone, he replied, drawing her closer. Together they stood at the window, contemplating the future that stretched before them, a future neither could have imagined in the autumn of 1876, when a desperate young woman had fainted on a dusty trail and a solitary rancher had stopped to help. Their story, which had begun with the simple words, "My home is yours now," had evolved into something far richer and more profound, a shared life built on trust, respect, and an enduring love that had transformed them both. As they turned away from the window and toward their bed, where their son slept peacefully in his cradle nearby, Katherine offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, for the hardships that had led to joy, and for the man who had become her shelter in the storm of life. On a crisp October morning in 1878, almost exactly 2 years after Katherine had collapsed on the trail to Eureka, their second child was born, a daughter they named Elizabeth Martha Stone, with Katherine's honey-brown hair and Xavier's determined temperament. As Xavier held his daughter for the first time, with William toddling curiously around the bedroom under Martha's watchful eye, he marveled at how completely his life had changed. The solitary existence he had once accepted, as his fate had given way to a home filled with laughter, love, and the beautiful chaos of family life. And it had all begun with an act of kindness on a dusty Montana trail, a moment of compassion that had opened the door to a happiness neither he nor Katherine could have imagined possible. In saving her, Xavier had ultimately saved himself, finding redemption and purpose in the love they shared and the family they had created together. As the years passed, the Stone Ranch prospered, expanding its operations and becoming one of the most respected in the territory. William grew into a thoughtful, responsible young man who shared his father's love for the land and his mother's quick intelligence. Elizabeth, fiercely independent from an early age, developed a talent for working with horses that amazed even the most experienced cowboys in the region. 2 more children joined the family, another son, James, named after Xavier's fallen brother, and a second daughter, Anne, who arrived as a surprise blessing when Katherine was 41. Their home, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, became known throughout the region as a place of warmth and hospitality, where travelers could always find a hot meal and a friendly welcome. Katherine never forgot those desperate days when she had walked alone, pregnant and abandoned, toward an uncertain future. The memory of that time gave her a special compassion for others in need, and the Stone home became a sanctuary for many a lost soul over the years, young women in circumstances similar to Katherine's own, widows struggling to support their children, men down on their luck seeking honest work. Xavier, watching his wife's generosity with quiet pride, often remarked that her greatest gift was her ability to transform hardship into blessing, a talent she had first demonstrated in their own love story. And so, what had begun as tragedy, a woman abandoned and left to die on a desolate trail, had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love freely given and gratefully received. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends from throughout the community, Xavier raised a glass to his beloved wife, his eyes still holding the same tenderness they had shown on that first Christmas Eve, when they had exchanged gifts by the fire. "To Katherine," he said, his deep voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "who taught me that sometimes the greatest treasures in life are found in the most unexpected places, even on a deserted trail in the middle of nowhere." Catherine's eyes shone with tears of joy as she raised her own glass in response. And to Xavier, who promised me a home and gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. As they shared a kiss that still held the passion and tenderness of their younger days. Those who knew their story best nodded in appreciation of the journey they had traveled, from strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners bound by a love that had only deepened with each passing year. Their story, whispered among the settlers of Eureka for decades to come, became something of a legend in those parts, a reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, love could take root and flourish, transforming lives and hearts in ways no one could predict. And it had all begun with those simple words spoken by a solitary rancher to an unconscious woman on a dusty trail. "My home is yours now." Words that had, against all odds, become the foundation of a life filled with love, purpose, and the enduring joy of family, a happy ending neither Xavier nor Katherine could have imagined on that fateful autumn day when their paths had first crossed in the wild heart of Montana.